This is March 20th, 2023, and it was 20 years ago today that the United States invaded Iraq. And also, it was just recently that we passed the one-year mark of the war in Ukraine. And I thought I would ask you to allow me to air some of my mixed feelings about the war in Ukraine and our country's involvement in the war in Ukraine. As we've been steadily fed reports on the war over the past year, I've found myself considering the first precept, not to kill but to cherish all life. And I thought, I can't be the only one in the Sangha who's pondering the karmic consequences of our country's military support for Ukraine, or what would be the karmic consequences of ending our support or not having given so much military support, staying on the sidelines. So I want to just explore the morality of all of this, and some of it will be counterpoint of the Buddhist. I'll presume to offer the Buddhist perspective on all this. So just to get the ball rolling, on the face of it, how could we not give military aid to Ukraine? It's a sovereign state, illegally invaded by the Russian Colossus. Few countries beside Russia itself would claim that Ukraine is theirs to occupy. And we know there's a lot of history behind that. But wait, what would the Buddha say? Just to play on that bumper sticker, what would Jesus do? What would the Buddha say? In fact, what did he say in the sutras? Or what did he purport to have said in the sutras? We know that Zen has always been known as the teaching beyond words without reliance on the sutras. But still, we could take that to mean not over-reliance on the sutras, not attachment to the sutras, because many of the greatest masters studied deeply the sutras and quoted the sutras. So we can wonder, what the Buddha really said, but it's I think a good place to start. In one of the shortest and most famous of the sutras, the Dhammapada, again, these purport to be the words of the Buddha, he says, all beings fear violence, all fear death. Using oneself as a criterion, one should not kill or cause death. All right. The United States and other NATO countries and other countries have been causing death to the extent that we've been sending billions of dollars of military support to Ukraine. Here's another one. Just to sum up what some of the sutras say, that Buddhism rejects violence in all its forms, from the collective manifestation in armed conflict, war, to the more individual, subtle stirrings of ill will. And of course, we have our own first of the 10 cardinal precepts. I refrain not to kill. I, I, I cherish. I resolve not to kill, but to cherish all life. So, broadly speaking, there's no question that Buddhism as a whole, for centuries, many centuries, has spoken out strongly against violence and war of all kinds. But wait, governments obtain their legitimacy in part from the ability to protect their citizens from ruthless aggressors. When a nation violates the rules of peaceful coexistence, the obligation to restrain aggression may trump the obligation to avoid violence. And we see this in the Charter of the United Nations, which sees physical force as a last resort, but condones its use when allowing the transgressor to proceed unchecked would have more disastrous consequences than that of resisting through military means. And still, that's the United Nations. That's worldly convention. That's not in the realm of the religious or the spiritual, strictly speaking. Scholars say that the Buddha considered wars of aggression utterly unethical. Of course, being an obvious expression of greed and or hostility. However, the state has to safeguard its citizens from aggressive enemy forces, and sometimes the need arises for the state to resist unjustified aggression. And yet, nothing in Buddhist sutras gives any support for the use of violence as a way to resolve conflict. But now let's get into more of the subtleties. The Buddha, I did some reading before giving this talk. The Buddha, scholars say, Buddha addressed himself as an individual to individuals. Even when he spoke to large groups, as he often did, he focused on individual responsibility. One Buddhist scholar said that the Buddha had no theory of, nor belief in, supervening collective structures of society or government that could amend or replace the bedrock of individual choice. So, the governance of a state, even in the Buddhist time, presented a moral quandary. In one short sutra, this I found very interesting, one short sutra, the Buddha ponders this question: is it possible to rule a country righteously? That is, without killing and instigating others to kill, without confiscating the property of others, without causing sorrow. So now we're getting into the middle of this, our involvement in Ukraine. But we're on the edge of our seats waiting to see what the Buddha says about how to rule a country righteously, when in the sutra Mara appears. Mara is the personification of the devil. He appears and begs the Buddha to give up his monastic vocation in order to rule. And then that's it. The question is left hanging. No, it's hard enough on an individual level to make moral absolutes out of this matter of violence in the first precept. What would that mean? What's absolute moral purity with regard to the first precept? No, more on that later. In my reading, I was reminded that the sutras don't admit any moral justification for war. So if we took the sutras as moral absolutes, that is, if we took nonviolence as an ideal, war can never be morally justified. And by extension, our military support for Ukraine can't be morally justified. So how is the international community to deal with a nation, Russia, determined to impose its will by force? So these specific situations, this one and the other obvious one from the last century, the Hitler's aggression, his annexation of other countries, his invasion. Other than that, these things can be morally complex. We need, in other words, to negotiate between these claims of moral absolutism while curbing the tendency to act from self-interest. There it is, self-interest. And that, I think, is the key thing. It seems I'm pretty comfortable, not entirely, but I'm pretty comfortable with our country continuing to support, giving military support to Ukraine. To the extent that it's largely not self-interest. It's not for our own benefit, even more than other countries. That's the key, isn't it? I've given many shows over the years on the different moral criteria, ways of interpreting the precepts. The strictest is from the Theravadan point of view. This is very close to a moral absolute, and I've given the example of real life example of one of our members who, while living in Burma, now Myanmar, reported that she and her husband had seen a rabid dog tearing into a playground, foaming at the mouth, and how she had called the local police station, and they stood on their Buddhist principles and said, no, killing is wrong, period. Killing any life is wrong. And she said the dog went on to kill 9 children. So, okay, that's one extreme. The Mahayana, of which Zen is a part, the Mahayana tradition, is to consider what is, in any situation, what is the greatest good for the greatest number. or another way of putting it is, what would entail the most compassion? And who would argue that from that point of view, they should have shot the dog? That would be a compassionate response, and hence a morally correct one, skillful one. So what happens to our commitment to non-violence when the dreadful nature, the dreadful consequences of war seem necessary to deter a greater and more destructive evil? You know, there's the original Zen monastery in China that is the one that Bodhidharma sat in the hills outside the monastery. It's called Shaolin, and there is this this distinction of Shaolin as the place where monks were trained in martial arts, and according to one text I read, that their premise for using their martial arts was to do so only with the minimum necessary defensive force. The minimum necessary defensive force. It would seem from what we read in the media that that's what President Biden and his advisors are trying to do, trying to avoid poking the bear, the Russian bear, to the point where nuclear annihilation, or even less, some wider war would be provoked. So that makes sense. A war of defense rather than aggression. Well, speaking of the 20th anniversary of our invasion of Iraq, that was certainly a war of aggression. I mean, many of us had good intentions, saw good intentions behind that, based on what proved to be false claims of weapons of mass destruction in the hands of Saddam Hussein. But still, it was initiated by us. Many would say in order to, same thing, it was a compassion, behind it was compassion. We wanted to liberate Iraq from Saddam Hussein. But this one in Ukraine is different. I think one person who had quite an influence on my thinking about all this is Nicholas Kristof. He's a longtime columnist for the New York Times. Probably many of you know him from his highly principled positions on other moral issues, trafficking of women, even pornography, where he pointed out the dark side of pornography, the pornography industry. But I think no one has more street cred than Nicholas Kristof in terms of really really getting involved, even on the ground, to help all kinds of oppressed people, women, minorities, refugees. It's just a career of compassion. And this is what one thing I found that he said. I found this on the web. When one nation invades a neighbor and commits murder, pillage, and rape, traffics in children, pulverizes the electrical grid to make citizens freeze in the winter, in such a blizzard of likely war crimes, neutrality is not the high ground. It's hard for me to disagree with him. We can cling to our principles of nonviolence as Buddhists, as noble Buddhists, but I don't buy it in this case. He goes even further. He says, if anything, I'd like to see the Biden administration provide more weaponry to Ukraine. For the best way to end the war is to ensure that Putin finds the cost of it no longer worth paying. Yeah, I that's my concern as well, that month after month, Ukrainian civilians and soldiers are dying. Ukraine goes on bleeding and bleeding. Whereas if we provided, the United States and other countries provided a stronger force, we'd have a better chance of ending all this. And then the counterpoint. Now we see China getting cozy with Russia. Just this week, I read about that, and it's not beyond our imagination that this could lead, if China really goes full on in support of Russia, this could lead to World War III. But who would suggest that Ukraine should have just rolled over without fighting? Or that we should have just watched from our safe perch here, protected by oceans on both sides? Who would argue now, with the wisdom of hindsight, that more shouldn't have been done earlier to hold back Hitler and his Nazis? Who would argue that you should watch your wife or child be assaulted because of your clinging to the moral absolute of nonviolence? It's just not, it just doesn't make sense. There's no, moral absolutes are an abstraction. That kind of purity is an abstraction. We don't live in that world. We may aspire to and may do our best to uphold this first precept of not killing but cherishing all life. But look at these other considerations. Is there anything more more complex than ethics? Is there anything more complex than ethics? Sometimes not. Sometimes it's clear what we should do, crystal clear. But reasonable people can argue this, and I'm not certain that we're doing the best, especially if what's going on now. We in a year or 3 years, we find ourselves in World War III. What then? Well, that's how I see things right now, at this point in time. And if it has helped at all with the rest of you sorting through this, then perhaps it wasn't a waste of time, these 20 minutes or so. Thanks for listening. Until next time.